appreciate to take a part in this conference. And this conference, actually, last summer vacation, I conducted a research about a joint economic collaborative project between South Korea and North Korea. The special economic zone is located in North Korea for the last more than 15 years. And I conducted a research together with a American professor by the name of Oliver Williams. He's a very famous business ethics professor at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana State of Indiana in the United States. And we looked at the case of this very significant B4P project. It's almost unlikely peace-building project between North Korea and South Korea. And it really went through the ups and downs and so on and so forth. And as an academic, I think this is a very important research agenda to look at. And as an academic, we are responsible. As a responsible researcher, we got to present some sort of guideline or kind of way to go. So through this project, yesterday morning planning session, I was very honored to be part of one of the panelists there. So this time, that's the reason why I'm here for this conference. So once again, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very much looking forward to this today's session. And already it has been quite a learning experience for me as well. So B4P as a research agenda, what can we do about this?
Thanks so much. Dr. Hasan, it would be great if you introduce yourself and talk maybe a little bit about how you bring sort of an academic background, but with this practitioner lens.
I'm Hasan Youness. I'm a university professor. I teach at a few universities in Lebanon. I lecture at Notre Dame University in Lebanon, Lebanese International University, Sharjah University, and USG, St. Joseph University. I teach a variety of courses in the field of international business management, human resource management, entrepreneurship management, the cousins of management, all the relevant courses. I'm heading the Sustainability Commission in the National Council for Entrepreneurship and Innovation in Lebanon, which was newly launched. And I have co-founded Insights for Consultancy and New Training Center. And now I'm serving as the strategic advisor of Global Compact Network Lebanon. So I wear the hat of academician and practitioner. And coming from Lebanon makes the topic of business for peace very timely, especially that it's a very hot topic in Lebanon. With the civil war which we have survived and witnessed, and with the flow now of the Syrian refugees, the Palestinian refugees previously, the topic of peace has always been an issue. Definitely, we need the contribution of the private sector, and we need the contribution of the academic sector, because the future generations have to be prepared to confront this issue and the repercussions of the issue, which we are still witnessing and feeling, even if the civil war has ended in the year 1990. But the generation which has preceded us is the war generation, and we are witnessing the repercussions. This gives the academic institutions a more indispensable role than ever before. However, as Prime mentions, the academic institutions have limited capacity. This limited capacity makes resorting to the private sector more indispensable than ever before. And the private sector wants to survive in a state where peace prevails, where stability prevails. Otherwise, the economic perturbations, the uncertainties will have a negative impact on their well-being and on their anticipated growth. That's why this creates a mutual benefit for a potential partnership between the private sector and academia, and synergy can be created in that perspective. So I guess we can take the conversation from that direction regarding Lebanon.
Great. Thanks so much. And now, Dr. Hala, if you could give your entrepreneurship lens to it, but also a great teaching lens to it.
Thank you so much. My name is Hala Hattab. I teach entrepreneurship at the British University in Egypt. Basically, I'm a chemical engineering graduate. I was working in the industry and corporate while I was doing my master's and PhD. And after receiving my PhD, I moved to academia and started teaching at the university. So having this background of corporate, and then when I joined academia, I noticed the detachment that the students are having. Because they're separate, as it's two separate worlds. One is about education, and then what's happening outside is something totally different, and what they're exposed to, what they study, etc. So because I believe in entrepreneurship, the value of entrepreneurship, I started majoring in entrepreneurship and sustainability at our university, and then started working with the students in competitions like Enactus, Nobel Prize, etc. And I've noticed that the students, unfortunately to say this, that they're not much welcoming for such activities and initiatives. We're having other outside the university that are concerned about parties, trips, etc., and you'd find hundreds of students joining these activities, while our students are minimum, like when we talk about Enactus or any other. So I thought that I really want to work with the students closely, because I feel that these kind of competitions integrate the students within the society. The younger generation, because I basically teach at the undergrad level, and I can tell you, there is a huge gap between the students at the university and what's happening outside. I even keep asking them, what do you do on Facebook? You spend hours and hours checking Facebook, you don't know what's happening in Egypt or any other. I tell them, I use lots of viral stories that are on Facebook that everyone is talking about, and I find the students, they're not aware of what's happening. So because of this gap that I noticed, and that was one of the main reasons why we joined PRIME at the beginning. We joined PRIME in 2015, and we thought such an initiative can help us to bridge the gap between basically from the student side and what's happening outside on the outside. So in 2015 we joined PRIME. And basically we had lots of initiatives and activities were going at the university, and it did not happen. For example, we have a full major for entrepreneurship and sustainability, which is one of the things that PRIME advocates. And we did not know that this was happening, or governance, or ethics. We have a course in business ethics for students. So when we joined, that gave us an umbrella to work under. And since then, we're trying to make more activities in the university towards even that we're encouraging our teaching assistants who are preparing the PhD to focus on governance, ethics, peace, etc., so that they can contribute to marketing. Maybe I'm looking at the piece from a different perspective, because I believe, since I work with the younger generation, the more they are equipped, the more they are exposed, the more they are aware that they need to be part of the community, the society, they can spread peace. Peace is not only the thing that we know that we don't have war, we don't have conflicts. Peace is even in the way how we deal with each others within the organization, for example, or as part of our daily communication with other subordinate supervisors, the community, etc. So this is how I look at peace in the organization. I think this is even important under the number 16, the extension number 16, that this is how we. But this is the way. This is why I'm integrating the PRIME and those activities within the. In terms of research, I think, and it's unfortunate that in Egypt, basically the research on entrepreneurship or ethics or peace, it's just still not matured yet. We started a few years ago, but we need a lot to move to say that we are not mature, we have more papers that we can. So I think this is what could be another way where we can encourage and participate further in it.
So just to pick up on some threads that are throughout all three of your introductory remarks, one of the things that seems to be there is this notion that everybody else has been talking about peace for a long time, and business seems relatively new to the party. And I found this certainly in my research, that a lot of the great research that's out there is research in political science, research in economics, research in development economics, and it's this whole other world of conversations that's happening. They don't realize that the private sector is a major part of their research, and we don't realize that their research is even out there to a certain extent. So I wonder if any of you might be able to speak to this notion that there is this community related to peace building that's there, and whether you've been able to tap into that or not.
If I may take it to the 17 SDGs and the contribution of the companies of the private sector to these 17 SDGs, we've done a little research to see which SDGs are being mostly tackled by the corporations, by the private sector in Lebanon in their CSR agenda. One of the least tackled SDGs is peace building and strong institutions. Maybe if we realize the relation between strong institutions and peace building, we think that the most resources in the CSR agenda have to be committed towards peace building and to partner with universities and field of academia to promote this notion as well, because it will lead to stronger institutions.
Well, actually, myself, I'm also the professor who is not very well aware of such possibility of business sector's role toward building peace. But when I conduct this research and also take a look at the literature and so on and so forth, I realized that peace is the very ultimate agenda of social responsibility. And yesterday, the people talked about this concept of positive peace, not just negative peace. This is what peace studies theories suggest. Negative peace is just about ending war and ending conflict and declare some cease of the war and so on and so forth. What is positive peace? Positive peace is all about building society equitable as possible, justice. So building this healthy ecosystem in society community, that is the positive peace. So we are talking about social responsibility, and we are talking about the newly emerging management paradigm called stakeholder perspective of running business. This is a big issue in strategic management, including Harvard professor Michael Porter. Creating shared value is all about creating equitable, society where each and every stakeholder's, value are balancing. So this is all about building peace, right? So business has a strong power toward building peace, and actually that's the notion of a UN Group Compact, right? When the UN Group Compact established it, business, private sector's role, right, building such equitable society is very necessary in this, especially in this global post-industrial world, right? So thanks to all this discussion, I came to know such possibility of the private sector.
Well, maybe coming from corporate sector before joining academia, and I can tell you this, that there is this disconnect between the corporate and peace. For example, for them they look at it's enough that we're doing our duties toward the society through corporate social activities, and we're happy. We're serving the community, we're serving the society through our activities. However, for them, the peace as peace is not existent. They don't. So that for them, the peace is as a term. It's not existent. For them, they look. This is the responsibility that they have. They're not. They don't need to be invited for any kind of activities that would promote peace, because they feel that this is not their responsibility. So I think this is one of the challenges that really need to be raised and need to be discussed. Because for corporates, usually it's numbers, and they will look at the numbers. Like at the end of the day, at the end of the year, when we look at our financial statements, how we achieve the return on investment that we were aspiring. So for them, when they try to do anything, they will look at the numbers. They will look what's on it for us when we do this, when we commit to peace, when we try to promote it. How is this will be useful for us? And I think this is one of the areas where it needs lots of research and investigations. What peace can bring to companies, especially as you just say, people would look at peace as it's no conflict, no war, and that's it, we're fine, we're living in a peaceful world, which in reality this is not the case.
Yeah, and so I think what's interesting, Dr. Hall, just to pick up on that point, is at this point now, about 10 or 15 years after the beginning of this Business for Peace as a research field, we have a pretty good sense of some of the ways that businesses can enhance peace. One of them is the one that most people think of, which is economic development, but not just in terms of providing jobs, also doing things like training, knowledge sharing, having joint ventures, so that there's a good interchange between people. We also know that there's a pretty decent relationship between business activities that promote the rule of law and peace. So whenever there's stronger governance mechanisms within the company, what we find is that leads to better peace outcomes. Similarly, any type of risk assessment that's built into the company, any way that the company can try to mitigate risk in their operations and conflict zones, seems And then the final thing that companies seem to be doing is track 2 diplomacy. So engaging with multiple actors, and this is very much the Korean example, is having businesses be the go-between when conflict parties don't want to directly interact with each other. So the Korean example is a great one. I think also South Africa, it happened most prominently. We have these great examples, and it sounds like some of it is just getting the word out there, right? Making sure that we spread the word among people so that they know about it. But then the other component that you touched on, which I think is great for those, for the academics in the room, and for the researchers, is can we get better research quality from more places about these sorts of examples? So some of the examples are really great and well researched and thoroughly researched, like on economic development. Others are not. So we have some anecdotal evidence, and some of them we have qualitative data, but we don't have great quantitative data. And so that's an area where on the research front,
if you check out the research about entrepreneurship, you will find so many papers, hundreds of papers, thousands of papers discussing the impact of entrepreneurship on economy, job creation, creating wealth. But how many papers do we really have on the impact of entrepreneurship on peace or like adopting these concepts? It's very limited. Again, this opens the door for research.
Speaking of entrepreneurship with the new majors of sustainable entrepreneurship and the new courses of integration of sustainability in entrepreneurship, we as academic institutions, when we want to train our entrepreneurs or prepare our entrepreneurs to hit the market, we can train them with the notion of sustainability rooted in their mindset and their individual culture, and with the trendy concept of social entrepreneurship. I guess we would be approaching the notion of peace better than ever before. So here comes the role of academia with the sustainability education. Even if our graduate doesn't become an entrepreneur, not everyone can become an entrepreneur. He can be an employee, a classical employee, or an entrepreneur. In both cases, he has the notion of sustainability, which is contagious actually, and which he can implement in the workplace. And I agree with you regarding the divorce between academia and the private sector. Actually, what might draw a bit of optimism is the relationship between PRIME and the Global Compact, UNGC. Because PRIME is academia and UNGC empowers the private sector. I guess this can be replicated on the ground via closer partnerships between academia and the private sector. Once we realize the power of the private sector, which is growing more than ever before, we can't have this divorce anymore. Okay, with the concept of CSR prevailing, the private sector is having more than before a socially responsible agenda. And CSR, according to Harvard Business School professor, who was my professor, Cash Campbell, we have 3 theaters of CSR. The first of which is philanthropy, the second is doing CSR across our supply chain, and the third is having an impact on the ecosystem. If I want to stick to this first theater, which is philanthropy, as private sector, we want to be philanthropic. Okay, we just give donations in kind or in cash. However, we can be strategically philanthropic. Strategically philanthropic may be via funding the research which the academicians do for peace building. So this might create an opportunity or a common ground between the private sector and the field of academia. And if this mutual ground is not created, we will keep on speaking of negative peace as you just mentioned. I perceive negative peace as a corrective measure. However, positive peace as a preventive measure. When we have this partnership or this collaboration between private sector and academia, we will have a preventive approach, a proactive approach. We will decrease the uncertainties, the volatility of the societies. So this will play a preventive rather than a curative role.
If I can mention about the research, please, in this field. Well, the PRME is all about the new paradigm movement in terms of management education. And obviously, we have 6 principles in this. And We have principles about vision and mission, and principle about teaching, and obviously principle about research is very important, one of the principles. And so we're talking about new paradigm in management education, so we need new paradigm in research. And we professors in this field, business professors, are so much accustomed to like old-fashioned research paradigm, so to speak. And I think one of that is too much obsessed with hypothesis testing. Get the sample, conduct a survey, and sitting in the comfortable chair and looking at the computer monitor and run the regression model or whatever the statistical model might be. And now this is the result. So they sort of impose this is the results and this is what to do. But I think in this highly interconnected world and in this post-industrial world and postmodern world, global world, everything is connected to everything in every possible manner. So this is kind of an egocentric, research paradigm. What I think, what we professors think good, it must be good for you. There should be way each time. It got to be changed. The new paradigm should be all about multi-stakeholder collaboration. It is more than just a hypothesis testing. This is something like exploratory, journey. So we need a lot of, stakeholder collaboration, obviously including private sector. So I sort of sense this kind of necessity of transforming into the new paradigm while conducting my own research this time. How can we better, conduct the research to meet with the needs for this new, era stakeholders? For example, in my case, it's about North Korean workers, North Korean, the middle managers and customer partners, and South Korean workers and government people and so on and so forth. Then what might be the legitimate way of conducting research in this kind of, situation? So, but once again, we professors need to invite more stakeholders involved in conducting our research. And our research should not be one-shot hypothesis testing game. It should be continuous improvement of the situation toward building peace. So what's so-called the action research is kind of the revival, kind of the paradigm. Well, in the social science field, during the early 20th century, people talk about this action research, and I think we got to look at this action research in this 21st century.
So I think that's a great point, and before Dr. Holland jumps in, I think some of our colleagues in other fields, especially in the social science, especially in places like anthropology and sociology, have not left that. And so some of it for us may be just either rediscovering it, if we've forgotten it from graduate school, or discovering it for the first time, where there's to figure out that there's not just positivist, quantitative methods that are associated with these things, but there are rigorous qualitative methods that are associated with action research. And some of that is also learning. So I think a lot of times what happens is we finish our graduate degrees and we think we know everything we need to know about gathering data and doing research. And we forget our own continuing educational process.
The point that I want to tap in that was mentioned here, when you talk about the principles of prime, we talk about the research and as well we have partnership. One of the things when you look at the partnerships, we did that how we can invite the speakers from the industry, from the university, or how we can just send our students to work at other companies or maybe as internship programs. But one of the things that I think would advance the research or advance our knowledge is when we have a partnership, it's like to be a mutual relationship between researchers from one side and the corporates from the other side. Corporates have so many issues, the private sector in general, whether small companies or big companies, they have so many issues. They have lots of problems that they need to deal with. And all us academics or researchers on the other side, we're doing lots of research. This is why we do research. We have a problem that we want to investigate and find a solution. So why not? And this is one of the challenges and the issues that we need to think of. Because again, as our professor mentioned, that we feel that we're isolated, we're just sitting there. It's a way of how we can bridge the gap between academia from one side and industry from the other side. we have to give our population or the focus of our problem from the private sector. And the private sector has to seek us not to provide them with the graduates or to feature their work, but to seek us as a way of help them to solve the problems through our research activities that we are conducting at the university level, us as academia or academics or with our students.
So at that point, I want to pause and just see if there are questions. So I have tons of questions. I'm the moderator, that's sort of my job. Please, Ms. Dawn.
Yeah, I have a question related to
The microphone is coming to you so that everyone will be able to hear you.
I have a question related
If you could introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Dr. Noha Basuni. I'm a professor of marketing at the German University in Cairo, Egypt. So I want to thank the panelists. It has been very insightful for me. I do a lot of research on CSR and business ethics, and I'm still developing my interest, so to speak, in the business for peace, specifically research stream. So my question is, if you want to conduct research in this area with positive peace, like you were saying, Dr. Stephen, you can easily collect data, but with negative peace, how can you collect data in areas of conflict or conflict zones that are probably not accessible?
In fact, I would say negative peace is sometimes the easier data to get because it's been going on for 50 or 60 years. Deaths are easy to measure. And so usually negative peace is measured in deaths and fatalities, so it tends to be easier. Whereas the positive peace factors tend to be things that we might fight over more regularly.
But then you're talking about secondary data. If you want to collect primary data, do you publish in this area conceptual papers or qualitative papers, or you can have empirical papers as well? Because we know that empirical papers are much easier to publish generally. So what is your advice in this area?
I'll give you my experience and then I'll turn it over to the panel. So I just published a paper with empirical data from business owners and managers in Iraq, but specifically those who had done business in ISIS-controlled territories. And then now I have under review another paper with Syrian and Iraqi business owners who dealt with non-state actors and the government. So ISIS, but also Free Syria Army and all of those. Getting those interviews is very challenging. And I would say there's two resources to rely on. One is your institution's research ethics board. For us, it's our IRB, was incredibly helpful with this. So there's a lot of protection of the interviewees that you need to take into consideration. Even if you're doing anonymized surveys, which was part of our sample, you're going to have issues with people feeling comfortable talking to you and having confidence that you will keep their identity secret. Especially in my context, especially with ISIS-controlled territories, that was a big issue when we were dealing with them. Now it's relatively easy because ISIS has been rooted out of Iraq. Life is easy, people will talk to you. But at the time, it was very challenging. The second component of that is figuring out the right medium to communicate, and this is where, from my perspective, I relied heavily on our social scientists at the university. So relying on your sociologists, your anthropologists, and your political scientists to help guide you through what's the most rigorous methodological way to communicate with people. Sometimes that's face-to-face. That's really hard. So going to these locations is sometimes really difficult. I leave that up to you and your risk tolerance on whether or not you want to go to those places. But technology makes things incredibly easy. And so for some of these locations, in Syria, this was especially the case for me, it was just a matter of figuring out what are the technologies that people on the ground are using to communicate externally. And once you figure that out, it's often very easy.
Okay, since you come from a marketing perspective and since you're talking about technology, there is a concept of analytics of big data. And big data is the structured, unstructured, semi-structured, and social data, which can come from online sources and offline sources. So if you want to research a certain concept and you have certain keywords, if you just mention these keywords online, you will have tons of captions, of articles, of literature. So you can do your analytics via regression analysis, via trend analysis. You can figure out a certain pattern. You will arrive to massive amount of knowledge and of analytics to this knowledge which you wouldn't have had access to before. So I don't know if you're researching ISIS and the impact on whatever. You have certain variables. If you just put the mention of the variable or the hashtag of the variable, you will have a million and you have certain softwares to make some analytics of these hits, and this will be indicative of what you are researching. So technology in this context has a great contribution, and we are living in this Mac revolution. We are living in the fourth industrial revolution, which is social, mobile, analytics, and the cloud. So we have to leverage on technology to facilitate our research and to get the data which we are researching.
Thank you.
You may see.
Dr. Stewart, did you want to
I
answer?
just want to make one more comment. It's amazing that we are witnessing this new technology and how this new technology makes the world into a different level and so on and so forth. And I think there is now very significant kind of movement among business scholars. So for example, I happen to know about this group, but there is a community business professor group. They call themselves as Community of Responsible Business Research. Responsible Business Research, something like that. And I mean, you know that. These are the kind of community led by very top-notch scholars in the field. And what they're saying is, okay, going back to your question, qualitative research and quantitative research, the balance between these two. And more people realize the importance of this exploratory research in terms of qualitative research. So journals, top journals are realizing such necessity. Accreditory bodies realizing this kind of necessity. So this not just technological breakthrough, but all this institutional kind of endeavor is going down toward that kind of direction, valuing more about qualitative research. So even though it's hard to do, it's worthwhile to do that. And again, I mean, it all depends on scholars' own purpose and will.
Dr. Hasan,
Just one more point to add here. Now most of journals are encouraging collaborative research rather being an individual researcher doing all the work on your own. There is a collaboration that can happen between researchers, and it's now much more encouraged by the journals, Whenever we are having more than one researcher who's conducting, this gives more credibility and value to the paper. And this opens doors for us with the use of technology and the different many means of communications that we can do joint research while here in Egypt, for example. And if we want to investigate a certain situation in one of those areas, conflict areas, like Syria, Yemen, or any other countries, you will find lots of researchers or academics from those countries, and they are so much willing to participate in a joint research because they feel that they're lacking, there is something that they lack because of the situations at their countries. And you living in another country, this could give them an edge or maybe the window where they can share the situation and the data they've collected so that they can, as it is their window, it's one of the outcomes.
And a word of caution, always go with your government. So this may sound strange, but the thing that made my life a lot easier, this is just a personal experience, I never did anything without making sure that it was okay by the UAE government, which controls our institution, or which accredits us. So that may seem like a maybe obvious point, but it's worth mentioning. You don't want to get in trouble with your institution. Obviously, you want to do things that are in line with what people want. There may be avenues that certain people say, look, you can't go in that direction. There are bigger problems in the world. There will always be things to study. So if you, I never got any resistance from the UAE government, so they never gave me any issues. But it's always good to check.
It's an important point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Again, I have like 100 questions, but I want to open it up for everyone to see if anyone else has questions. Yeah, please. If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Mohammed Al-Borno. I'm a filmmaker and engineer. I work in creating content for entrepreneurs in Upper Egypt to teach them about how to start your own company and stuff like that. My question is about blockchain and I don't know, and then the cryptocurrencies. And did it offer any real business opportunities for refugees or people in areas of war? And if it's not relevant, so I apologize for the question.
touched on one of my favorite topics, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation if someone else wants to jump in. I mean, so the prototype example is the World Food Program. So I don't know if everyone else is aware of this, but the World Food Program essentially deployed a blockchain-based. It's Ethereum linked, so it's on the back of Ethereum coding, with the idea being that it's also linked with the biometrics of Syrian refugees in Jordan, so that they can go and pay for regular goods. And instead of having to pick up the physical food from the World Food Program, the World Food Program can disperse and distribute the food to various vendors. And those vendors can verify that the person coming in is actually a refugee through biometrics, usually through iris scans or fingerprints. And all of that is backed on an Ethereum-based blockchain backend, I guess. The UN system is doing its best, I think, to try to replicate the success of that program, because it makes not only the distribution of aid much easier, but it makes it a lot easier to justify to donors that the people who they say are getting the help are actually getting the help. From a Business for Peace side, I think the big place where we're going to see it be deployed is in the human rights and supply chain verification. So I think as blockchain becomes more distributed on the supply chain, we're going to see more programs like De Beers ran recently. So De Beers ran a program with, De Beers is one of the largest diamond manufacturers, retailers in the world, the largest. And what they did is, about 3-4 months ago, they deployed a blockchain for their suppliers who they did not own directly, so that they could actually see from the mine to the retailer, which are often, you'll go through 7 or 8 different countries throughout that process, that it went where it said it was supposed to go, and everyone could verify that each chain in the process was actually, it was made without being influenced by conflict zones. I think on the conflict side, we're going to see more of that. There's still a challenge of making sure that the inputs that are coming in are not fraudulent. So it's one thing to get the chain to be non-fraudulent, but there's still going to be input issues in all of those locations. But as the big companies start to shift in that direction, I think you're going to see small companies around the world start to adopt those sorts of practices. So from my end, I think that's where the big push is going to be. So it won't be so much cryptocurrencies. But the blockchain technology itself, I think, is going to underpin a lot of the verification that's right now really challenging. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on blockchain.
Well, I don't have much experience with blockchains or cryptocurrencies, but however, I just want to mention that when we started to have the mobile payment or the mobile cash, the amount of opportunities it opened for people, even in Upper Egypt, if we just look at Egypt, the case of Upper Egypt, when we started to have payment through the mobiles, it opened so many opportunities for small business owners, for the micro business owners, for women, for the marginalized segment in the society. So imagine if this is a very change in the use of technology, and it was accompanied by changing laws as well. So we need to be very careful when we are encouraging this kind of things, because the laws need to support such a motion. However, I want to say that with the little change in the law and the introduction of the technology of online or mobile payment, this has opened a huge amount of opportunities, and it helped so many people in Upper Egypt and other areas. They were disadvantaged, disadvantaged areas. So imagine if this little thing did this, what will cryptocurrencies will do to the future of entrepreneurship or people starting businesses.
And ICT and sort of those technologies are great examples of Business for Peace in action without people actually realizing that they're doing it. So there's this correlation that some folks have noticed, especially the Institute of Economics and Peace. They've done great work on showing this link between mobile phone subscriber rates and positive peace outcomes. So the companies that are very often going into places, companies like Ericsson might go into a location with the intent only of spreading mobile phone subscribers and making sure that there's better wireless coverage. And what they're actually doing is empowering people at the local level to have more involvement in their economic decisions, more involvement in their political decisions, without necessarily realizing it.
Actually, if I may elaborate on this notion, one of the contributions of education is to create equal opportunities for everyone. It has been that way since decades and since centuries, and now it's still there. However, historically, I can get equal opportunities, whether I'm poor and you're rich, we have equal opportunities. But in the previous industrial revolutions, the main asset was land, capital. You have to have a skyscraper to have a business. You have to have raw material. So even if I have this equal opportunity, I'll not be able to seize it, and I remain underprivileged or marginalized, and I remain poor. And poverty might be one of the contributors to uncertainty, and uncertainty might create an unpeaceful situation. Now, if we properly integrate the concepts of ICT and the new technology, the smart technology, as I've just named it, if people have access to this new technology, the poor and the rich, and living in a knowledge economy, then everyone can have equal opportunity to start a new business with a minimal startup cost, with a negligible startup cost. You can be an entrepreneur, leveraging on the power of these technologies, and you can develop your business, and you will no more be underprivileged because you are living in a knowledge economy. So we have to have such kind of education in our curricula. It has to be embedded.
And this is a great place to put in a plug. Prime has great resources for teaching. So if you're ever looking on the teaching side for resources, whether it's internal to your company, to doing training, or on the academic side to encourage people to use different types of resources in the classroom, Prime has a great set of teaching resources. Sometimes they're in individual working groups, but often the Prime login page that you've got for your institution will have those right there. There was a question at the back. Yeah, please.
My name is, my name is Hasan. I'm the Managing Director of the Aspen Institute and Middle East Leadership Initiative. We essentially work with business leaders in the Middle East to think about the social impact of the work we do and to redefine their social agenda. So that's what we do. We have about 100 fellows across all the countries in the Middle East, including those who are in conflict with each other. As I listen to you and to Dr. Hala, the presentation has been really very stimulating. I'm thinking about the excitement that we always see in everybody's eyes whenever we talk about how technology can be utilized, how new trends such as blockchain and cryptocurrency can be utilized to bring about an age-old concept such as peace. And the challenge I have with technology, not necessarily that I have one. By the way, I worked for 13 years for Microsoft, Oracle, and I've done the loop like yourself to think about, okay, it's not all about just businesses. But the challenge I have is that technology comes with values. And this is the V word I have not heard in your presentation so far. And I just want to ask, if we're starting to see, particularly from this conference, right, the excitement of the United Nations, GSDs, etc., that peace equals to sustainability. Right? In a way, we're equating the two words. But when we try to really decipher what sustainability entails, again, so far we've heard through this engagement that economics, entrepreneurship, environmental aspects are what brings about sustainability. However, that does not necessarily bring it, because it also can bring fragmentation. I visited Beirut several times, but recently I was taken on a tour to see the fragmentation that exists in Beirut, because based on political, religious, ideological divides, the investment is managed within specific segments of society. So sustainability can not only depend on economics, environment, and entrepreneurship. So there is another aspect that needs to be added to that, which is social cohesion. So the three E's that I mentioned, but social cohesion, which really can only come about through social justice. And I feel that the only way to bring about, particularly that all of you are in the field of education, the only way that we can bring about social justice is through, incorporated in a systematic way of moral education in schools. Unfortunately, in the Middle East, I've lived all over the world, including the Far East for many years, but coming back to the Middle East, I realized that moral education equals to religious education, which is unfortunately another cause of division. So my question to you, and there is a question, how come the V word, the values word, does not exist in any of our vocabulary? How come the investment that goes about in all sorts of research, particularly research related to cryptocurrency and blockchain and blah, 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 does not equate even to a fragment we don't even have a fragment of that that's invested in what Dr. Hala mentioned in terms of the business ethics and moral education focus.
Somebody want to take it first? Sure, go ahead.
Maybe I can just start from the entrepreneurship perspective. Now, one of the outcomes of the researchers in the field of entrepreneurship, in order to incorporate the value, the humanities, etc., now we are having what's called humane entrepreneurship. This is a very new term that's maybe introduced in 2015 in one of the big conferences, the ICSB conference, where they talked about the importance of incorporating the human dimension into the entrepreneurial process. Basically, we look at entrepreneurship as capturing value, even if it's not been mentioned and said out and loud. But entrepreneurship is about value. It's about how we can look at the needs within the society and try to solve them. Maybe the needs differ from one country to another. For one country, it could be a social need. For another country, it could not be. However, value is embedded within entrepreneurship. However, as I said in 2015 or 16, we said let's talk about the human aspect of entrepreneurship. Not the entrepreneur himself, not the employees of the organization, but the society as a whole, which is basically it's the foundation. We start with social entrepreneurship and now we are moving towards humane entrepreneurship. And I think this answers part of your question where we can see value, where we can see the moral education. And it's still there. And I think, unfortunately, one of the issues that, and this is the second point, that we refrain to discuss in the Arab world and the Islamic world, that religious education versus moral education, where we have more lectures, more classes to teach students religion, but very few classes to teach students ethics and morals. And unfortunately, what's happening is that we are having a disparity between the two terms. And this is something we refer to discuss in public, for example. And if maybe you did not bring up such a question, we would not even tackle it. This is one of the, maybe this tackles the second point. This is
Actually, I guess the value creation notion which you have talked about in relation to entrepreneurship is not the value he's talking about. You are talking about certain principles or principle-based business. Apart from the value creation of entrepreneurship, maybe the value creation goes in terms of the contribution or the contribution of the components of the supply chain. But
basically, and personally, maybe this is my personal opinion about entrepreneurship. I look at its values, not the value added. That's maybe. I'm sorry for misunderstanding that. Maybe it's you misunderstood. No, what I meant is the values that he was mentioning. Because I don't look at entrepreneurship as something. It's an economic activity. For me personally, I don't look at it even if it's for the sake of achieving profit at the end of the day. Yet entrepreneurship is not. It's the value. It's not only the value is to achieve profit. It's the values that we need to spread. Like when trying to tap into the problems that the society, we create values here. When we try to solve it, when we try to the mindset, the creative mindset. As you said, that not everyone becomes an entrepreneur. Not everyone starts a business. However, having this entrepreneurial mindset, the way we approach problems, the way we introduce ourselves, we tap into different aspects. This is entrepreneurial. And the outcome of it, or maybe the result of it, maybe achieving the values that we must bring.
Actually, I understand values as principle-based businesses. I'll give a few examples. When you talk about religious education, you're so right. I teach and I have had 2 of my degrees at Notre Dame University in Lebanon, which is a Catholic and Imam university. And their mission is taken or inspired from the Catholic teaching. And later, when they applied to NIASC accreditation, which is Nietzsche accreditation now, they have to abide by the principles of NIASC or Nietzsche, which is the most maybe prestigious accredited institution, and they were NIASC accredited lately. One of the principles, the 9th principle, is integrity and transparency. Maybe when you teach with integrity, it contributes to more principles or to rooting more principles in the students who can become social entrepreneurs at a certain point of time. So I don't know, this might create the value you are talking about because social entrepreneurs address a certain cause, a certain need, a certain gap between what's being delivered and the expectations of the society. So this might lead to creation of value. But religious education is embedded in many of our institutions. And regardless of whether Muslim education or Muslim institution or Christian one, the values are similar. So I don't think, see it as being negative.
Sorry, do you want to do it?
Well, I like this question, right? That's the bottom line issue. So, well, the UNESCO actually they published this report on future education, and the very essence of this report, and that was published in the the world is moving into the new millennium, like in 2000, I guess. And their point is, we are moving from the old paradigm education, which can be defined as industrial era education, to new paradigm education, post-industrial era education. And industrial era education or paradigm can be boiled down to the notion of learning to know and learning to do. This is like a manual kind of education, piece of knowledge accumulation. And then the new paradigm is learning to be and learning to live together. So it's about being, to be. The education is all about character building to become an independent being, human being. And only independent human being can create mutually interdependent community. Then how can we do that? That's very important question and very challenging question. And I think this being me, well, we can easily think about Abraham Maslow, this. And being, it's all about being conscious, I guess. This is a question of who you are, and are we making right footsteps on our earth? So are we conscious about these awareness, two dimensions awareness? I think that's the kind of the way to become a human being. So our education, business education, how can we do that? Well, we can think about more than 1,000 ways of new pedagogical method of doing that, flipped learning and problem-based learning and so on and so forth. There could be hundreds and thousands of the variety version of all this. But I think it's all happening in the classroom. It's all happening between the relationship between students and professors. So I think it all starts with conscious professors. Back to the professors. So I can raise such faculty and community in our business school. That's a very critical question.
Yes, sir. I guess your question almost has two parts. So there's this teaching component, so what's our responsibility as educators of future business leaders? That's the sense that I got. But then there's this other sense of, okay, so we have these businesses, and we don't really talk about values. So from my research perspective, from the companies that I've seen in the region, the big multinational companies, I think don't like talking about values because it scares them. I think it scares them, especially when they're from outside of the region, because they're worried that something they're going to say might offend or might bother someone, that it might cross a particular line, and they're often not sure where that line is. So the multinationals, I think, that's why they're constrained. Among local companies, especially those who I've spoken to in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, they get it. They talk about values constantly. So when you talk to them about peace building, they get it for a simple reason, which is that unlike the multinationals, they don't have a choice. So they repeatedly would say something along the lines of, where am I supposed to go? These are people who are embedded in their communities. They don't have a choice, right? They have to live a certain set of values, and that means they have to make very difficult choices about who they're going to support politically, whether they're going to support anyone and sit on the sidelines. So a lot of the companies that I spoke to in Syria, there were seven companies that I spoke to that were able to live through 3 different regime changes in a 3-year period. So they had seen 3 different sets of governing regimes over a 3-year period. And the way they were able to manage that was by living their values. So you'd think that those companies were able to sit on the sidelines and that's how they were able to do it. It was in fact the reverse. They were perceived of as being honest brokers. And that's something the literature has talked about for years. So Timothy Ford, who's at Indiana University, who's my advisor at GW, has been talking about this for 10, 15 years. this notion of business as being this mediating institution. And it can be, but I think multinationals get really put off by that notion that they can be the brokers. And especially when it's not an environment they're as comfortable with. That's my sense of why some of that is happening. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you think it's happening, because I'm sure you have some opinions on it, having dealt in the region for a while. On the teaching side, I think for us it comes down to something I didn't realize before I came to the region. So I'm originally from New York. I went to a small liberal arts college for my undergraduate education. I did not do a business degree. Something I didn't realize until I started teaching undergraduate business in the Middle East was that undergraduate business schools are like liberal arts colleges. It's the place where people who don't get into engineering schools and medical schools go to. So their parents tell them, well, you're not doing engineering, right? So you gotta go do business. And so the responsibility for us, I think, is actually higher than it is in a lot of other regions with respect to business education. That's especially true at the undergraduate level, but I think it applies at the graduate level as well. Something we've done at the American University of Sharjah to deal with that is by mandating ethics education. So business ethics and social responsibility is a core component of the degree. You have to take it to graduate. You have to take it before you get to the capstone. It's just a prerequisite, and it's something that we pride ourselves on, but we also get that we have this role that's different from a lot of other business schools in the West or in other regions. Right? It's just a peculiarity of the MENA region. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but at least from the UAE standpoint, I think a lot of times business schools end up being liberal arts colleges. It's where everybody goes.
Actually, one of the prerequisites to be accredited as a university or as a school is to integrate business ethics into your curriculum. So ABIT accreditation for engineering, AACSB accreditation for the School of Business, and all the accrediting institutions encourage, or not only encourage, it's a prerequisite, otherwise you cannot be accredited. That's why it's good, it's a step that we are integrating the topics of ethics. Every graduating student has to know the value of respecting intellectual property rights, invasion of privacy, the notion of sexual harassment, conflict of interest. These notions are being well acquired by the students, and it helps to have a principle-based society. And the students, whether employed or whether they will be entrepreneurs, they will take them into the corporate life which we are seeking.
I can say this is the case in our university as well. We have one of our courses for the students is business ethics and corporate social responsibility. And as well, we try as much as we can to incorporate the concept of ethics in other modules as well. Like, for example, on entrepreneurial organizations, my course where I teach students how to start their businesses, one of the main lectures I teach them their responsibility towards the society, their investors, their customers, etc. Also, when we teach accounting and finance, we teach international business, even the concept of business on the international level, how we can bring ethics into such practices. So we try to do this as much as possible at the university level, and we hope, and this maybe gets into the responsibility of the private sector here as well, the partnership that we were talking about, how the private sector encourage the practices that we teach students at the university, because we teach them certain aspects of ethics, practices, etc. So what will be the responsibility of the private sector? So sometimes I think that it starts from us as academics or at the university level. However, in order to reach where we wanted to reach, the private sector here has to lead heavily.
Talking about ethics, even in the professional certifications as chartered financial analyst, one of the core topics is ethics. In the Society of Human Resource Management, CPP, certified professional, there are 8 HR competences which you have to have. The first category of these competences is ethics, which is promising. And even in the entrepreneurship competitions, in which in many cases I'm a jury, when we receive the scorecard for Health Prize, for Veritech competitions, Banque du Liban competition, Beirut District, CSR Al-Ahli in Jordan, Bristol entrepreneurship competition in UK, the component whose weight is growing rapidly is the extent to which the business will have a social impact. It is being ethical, there is social responsibility, or it's value-based. So it's good that we are integrating this into our education institutions, professionally, academically, and in the entrepreneurship competitions as well.
Dr. Any other questions for the audience? Okay, before I ask more questions. Did you have anything did you want to respond to anything anyone said? I want to give you the opportunity to chime in.
Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity, and really thank you for the response. I really enjoyed that. So, to your point about Lebanon and about religious values in business, I don't disagree with your point. Fundamentally, all religions are teaching common values. So these values involve charity, involve the well-being of society, etc., etc. However, you still see businesses that are owned or managed by certain religious factions, that the business, for example, hires people from a certain category and does not hire others. So let's not sort of kid ourselves and think that values are universal.
Okay, I repeat. I'm Hasan, so you can guess that I'm Muslim. Okay? So I teach at 4 universities, 3 of which are either Jesuit or Catholic. So there are some exceptions. Unfortunately, the general rule is as you were saying. But with time, the rate of non-affiliates or if the company is Christian and you have Muslims or vice versa, the rate of this diversity and inclusion is increasing. Especially, for example, in Lebanon, UNGC has around 200 members. We are approaching the 200 members. And when they give us their communication of progress by the end of the year and the alignment of SDGs and how they are dealing with the issue of diversity and inclusion, the numbers from year to year are more promising than before. I totally agree. In the year 1990, we have finished the Civil War. So the negative repercussions of the Civil War are there, will continue to be there. We have this kind of division. And in Lebanon, we have something called ست وست مكرر. If you want to give a license, ست وست مكرر for the 6 sects. If you want to give a license for a hospital, you have to wait until there are 6 applicants from the 6 different sects so that you give the license. It's part of the culture. Unfortunately, it's bad culture. We've been struggling with our government formation for the past 6 months, and the issue is religious, how we can distribute the 30 ministers across the 30 seats. It's there. But in the private sector, we are trying to have a bit of progress due to the impact of the Global Compact and some other institutions and the new generation, which is resisting that old culture.
So I just wanted to underscore that part, so thank you for acknowledging it. The second part I also wanted to acknowledge is what Dr. Hasan mentioned about the need for businesses to invest. As I mentioned, there are 2 elements of investment where I think businesses need to invest in. Number 1 is really ascending leaders in businesses, which is, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do. People who are under the age of 45 who have attained a level of success, right? Why don't we bring them around the table to talk about values-based leadership or principle-based leadership, as you termed it. And I think that's an important aspect of the transformation that needs to be invested in heavily, because these people have the opportunity and have the platform to actually make a difference. We can't invest in a 20-year-old young entrepreneur who's never seen anything in life, right? And they go on and burn some money and do a great job. And, yep, it might work. 90% of them, they're challenged after 2 years, but that's great investment and it's important. It's part of their education, no doubt about it. But we also need to equally invest in business leaders who have proven their success and have now a platform where they can do a massive change to society. So that's one area of investment where I agree with you. Businesses really need to put their money where their desire is if they want to establish sustainability. The other element, I'm really interested in this UNESCO report that Dr. Stephen had mentioned, and I'd like to follow up with you on that. And that's, to me, is another area where business really needs to put their money. And I think that's the area of moral education for the youngsters. So a 12 to 15-year-old that particular age group, I have a couple of my own kids in that age, that's when they define their moral compass. That's when they start making some moral choices. And if they see service to others and the well-being of their community as a component of who they are, then they will become that entrepreneur that we hope for. And I think, again, we do not have enough investment, certainly not in this part of the world, in moral education and on society-focused or community-focused education for that age group. And I would love to see more and more businesses investing in this. There's a couple of companies who are trying to do this in Egypt, a couple of experiments. High School, for example, is an interesting experiment to watch for. But I would love to see further investment in that space. So thank you so much for the comments. They've been very helpful.
So to your first point, by the way, so we run a program sponsored by Crescent Group, so it's Moderator's group, for Iraqi leaders. And it's that exact age range, right? So we try to get in, that's actually how my Iraq program worked with interviewees started there, with people who are really on the cusp of taking on full senior leadership roles, but who are from places where the environment's very difficult. I think what made it easier for us is that support. So the business support from Crescent was huge in making it work. And the fact that the Jaffer family is so involved in that process and making sure that it happens helps. I think the other thing that helps is sometimes it's helpful to get people out of their environment. So I think the reason why it's worked at AUS is because we're getting Iraqi leaders and taking them out of their environment, bringing them to the UAE. And I think that's something that might work in other contexts. The Lebanese context it might work for as well. I think it's very context dependent. And one thing we haven't talked about, we use the peace word a lot, but we haven't talked about war and conflict that much. And how some of the values are not good, right? So sometimes there's negative values that are there that need to be undone. And moral education can help with that. If it's a pervasive culture, though, that's problematic, sometimes it's a grain of sand, right, in the desert. Sometimes it's very difficult. I don't know if Dr. Stickman wanted to add about the UNESCO program.
Well, yeah. But actually, recently I wrote an article about that, so maybe I can send you the article. Well, actually, in China, one of the very famous Chinese philosophers by the name of Lao Tzu, maybe some of you know that the person, the philosopher, great philosopher, some 2,500 years ago, he once said, the best way to do is to be. It's about to become that kind of character, person. So I think we're saying that we are talking a new paradigm and so on and so forth. But I don't know. Maybe this is the education ought to be, or maybe this is the capitalism ought to be. Maybe this is what Adam Smith, when he wrote, Wealth of Nations, he visualized not the world like we are living today. Everything efficiency driven and cost driven and so on and so forth. So I think it's all about, once again, borrowing Maslo's term, self-actualizing, education, capitalism, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Are there other questions from the audience? We haven't heard from any students. Does any students have any questions or anything that piqued your interest that you want to talk about? You're all looking at each other like, no. And from industry, any questions from industry about how you can be engaged in this process and how you can help? We've heard of some great ways already. But any of the folks from the private sector want to chip in or have any questions? They've all left. So I guess with just a couple of minutes left then, Dr. Stephen, what do you see as the role for, oh yeah, go ahead.
There's a point I want to add to build on the argument. It's about the role of media. We haven't discussed this, and we have media, now I'm sure that many people are posting to Facebook, to the social media, etc., or maybe the media in general, and we have not talked about it, we have not tackled it. And some of the very success stories that we're talking about where the investments or the private sector were leading the principal-centered leadership or the principal-centered businesses, such success stories need to be celebrated in the media because those people are the champions. And they are moving or they are starting a new movement where we need to empower or embed the concept of principle-centered leadership or the value-centered businesses. So those people need to be celebrated in order to encourage other businesses or more businesses to follow their steps. So here comes the role of media. Also, when we talk about the businessmen, or maybe how, again, the point that you have discussed, how people perceive businesses. Again, this is the media, where we are introducing the entrepreneurs or the business owners as maybe people who are unethical, who are trying to do for them the means, the end justifies the means, etc. So if we started to focus on the success stories, where it's about ethics, it's about the integrity, it's about being honest with yourself, with your investors, with your customers, with the society, the social entrepreneurs, when we talk about the business competitions, because as well I serve as a jury in so many competitions inside Egypt and outside Egypt, I all the time find that people or the judges, the money goes to the let's call it the commercial entrepreneur, the one who generates income. But when it comes to the businesses who are, yes, we love to see the social impact. We love to see that, yes, they are impacting the society. But we want to get, when we are giving money, we give it to whom? To those who, let's call them not social entrepreneurs. So maybe here, the role of the media needs to play a more active role, where we focus the light on those businesses who are social, they are making or supporting the society, supporting the community, the wider community, have a message. Those are maybe shedding light on those businesses who are leading with principles and values.
Speaking of the role of media, I can't agree more. The role of classical media and the role of digital media as applied importance. Actually, in Lebanon, at the level of the Global Compact, we have for each SDG a national champion who is a top CEO in the country, and this CEO pledges when he's the advocate of this SDG with an advisory board to do activities which are relevant to this SDG, leveraging on his personal power and on the power of his big multinational corporation in Lebanon, which can be a bank or any other institution. So we've decided to create some exposure for these exemplary actions. We've talked with the Prime Minister in Lebanon, and we have prepared a CEO roundtable with the Prime Minister and his advisory board. It was live on all TVs and it was highly exposed. But then, when I came to Global Compact as strategic advisor, I have witnessed that the concept of SDGs is very exclusive to a certain elite, to a corporate elite. And I thought that the future generation, which is the mass, the youth, do not know this notion very well yet. Okay, the role of academia helps a lot, but these youth who are Gen Z or the technology natives or the post-millennials, they follow people on Instagram who have hundreds and thousands of followers, and they consider them idols. So I suggested on the board to have a media dinner under the title of Step into the World of SDGs. We invited the top 70 influencers in Lebanon from different fields, from the food and beverage, from the fashionistas, from different sectors, and everyone was going live, in addition to representatives from the classical media, a very fancy event actually. We got the funds from the private sector, and we wanted to show the notion of SDGs. These top 70 influencers, whose combined number of followers is more than 31 million, were live on Instagram, on Facebook, and everyone was asking what SDGs are. We have shown some videos which were live as well, and we've done some engagement. The followers were content creators. We featured this on all TVs because we had great content during this event. So the media helped us a lot. When we launched our forum, or our annual forum, and we opened the registration, we had the capacity of having 500 attendees. We closed the registration the third day because we had 1,046 registered. Most of them were from the youth. We received 750 at the end. We increased the capacity. So media is very important. And after these events, many companies asked for membership. The universities which weren't members in the Global Compact applied and sent their letters of commitment. That's why we are having a great exposure for them. And recognition is key. During our big forum, we've launched the SDG Milestone Awards under 4 categories. One of which is the small medium enterprises, the second for NGOs, for big corporations, and for academia. and we have created a rubric or a scorecard for each category with a mutable jury, and all the universities which were members knew that 4 or 5 months in advance, and they have had their communication on progress, on sustainability, and their everything relevant to our rubric, and they have applied, and we had one winner who was highly recognized as well. And this can be contagious to other universities. So media and recognition is crucial, definitely.
Any questions from the crowd before I jump in? Okay, so Dr. Stephen, when we talk about this role of the private sector, how, from a business standpoint, do you see the best interaction from the businesses with academia, and then from the academic side, from the academic leadership standpoint? So from the dean's suite and from the associate dean's suite, how do you engage with businesses to make sure that they're having the biggest impact on your students and on your curriculum?
Yeah, I think we are moving into this era where this the collaboration between the academia and the private sector, not just the private sector, all the stakeholders around involved. So, well, that is about teaching, design the methodology of teaching and contents of teaching and so on and so forth. That may be about, again, research. The research is not solely dependent on the sort of security the professors lab. So yes, more and more, this the collaboration between the private sector and also the relevant stakeholders. So multi-stakeholder collaboration in terms of teaching and research and so on and so forth. And if I can add one more thing, the business school itself, the running business school in a sustainable manner and responsible manner and cautious manner, that will be the most challenging. And we talk about corporate social responsibility, and it's high time to talk about academia's social responsibility. And we talk about stakeholder involvement in terms of strategic management for the private sector. It's high time to think about stakeholder perspective of running business schools. It's critical.
Dr. Howard, Dr. Hasan, I think that.
Okay, do you want me to find a comment or?
No, not a final comment, but at this point of business and.
Actually, when I'm remembering now something. When I was doing my BA between the 2002 and 2006, I've had a finance course. To get +5, you have to write 3 sentences. Cash is king. $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. And the primary objective of any corporation is to maximize shareholders' wealth. Shareholders' wealth. This was in the year 2003, maybe. Now we are talking about the notion of stakeholders. So in all the literature, just maximizing the wealth of the shareholders has become a bit outdated. You cannot only deal with the shareholders, especially that the stakeholders nowadays have more bargaining power than ever before. With the fierce competition, with the spoiled consumers, we as stakeholders have bargaining power. That's why businesses have to consult us. They have to please us. They have to wow us, to delight us through socially responsible practices. Sometimes businesses need a bit of direction. Who directs them? The academic institutions. So maybe if we as academic institutions conduct our research and show the return on investment in activities related to peace building, the dollar value in doing such activities, we can have businesses on our side. So here's our role. When companies adopt CSR, in all the conferences, when I talk about CSR, one of the audience says that this is greenwashing, this is blue washing, businesses use it to create brand equity, to market themselves. Okay, if this is their hidden agenda, and as long as they are having impact, let it be. So if they are searching for return on investment, for getting some exposure or whatever, let's show them the return on investment in investing in peace activities, because we are operating, as I said, in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous society. When peace prevails, this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity would diminish. And this will be reflected in an enhancement in value or in a higher return on investment. So we have to prove that for businesses, and they will be one of us.
But no. Well, this is what I was saying. This is the partnership that we need to have between the universities and the private sector, where we conduct our research, use them as our foundation for research. But the point that I wanted to raise here, that the new movement that we see in Egypt, I can talk about from the Egyptian perspective, and my colleagues at the academia can confirm such point, that now we have a younger generation joining academia. Now we are having a 30 years old who is a PhD holder and he's teaching at the university level, or even younger if they are teaching assistants at a very younger age. This movement, it could be a good start where we try to incorporate this partnership, because those young generation, they are more exposed, their technology is happy, they have been traveling around the world, they're on Facebook, they're on social media all the time, and they are also they have participated in so many students' activities. And this is one of the points, by the way, that is not discussed, like Hall Prize or maybe Enactus. There are so many students' activities that are happening at the university level that encourages the participation of the students. It's part of the extracurricular activities, but they are participating and trying to solve the problems of the society through these competitions. So those students, those younger generations, the young academics, they've been part of all these movements. They have seen the good and bad, and they have tested it. And with this exposure, I think they can serve as a very good role model for the younger students. They can be the flag carrier in terms of conducting this partnership between the private sector and the university in order to promote those like sustainable businesses, sustainable practices, principles sector businesses, and so on. So I think this is one of the things that we really, and honestly, I see it in Egypt, and I think we need to celebrate it, that those people can do what could not do.
Yeah, and so to second that, I think it also comes down to institutions. So I've been very lucky as a 32-year-old associate professor who started teaching at 26 to have an institution that was highly supportive of young faculty members. And so from an institutional perspective, those of you who are in those institutions, bringing them in and making them feel like they're really a part of it and they have something to add is really crucial.
Actually, it's very good that the students identify with the professor regardless of the age of the professor. Even if you are 50, 60, 70, I don't know, and you're still trendy in your thought, the students will identify with you and they will consider you an idol. So when you talk about values, they will adopt these values. I started teaching at the university level at the age of 23. I've been teaching 11 years now. And I believe that I can play this role. I have played in the eyes of the students and in the eyes of the university top management as well. Because whenever I have a case for the top management about integrating, for example, a course called Trends of Business, based on a book which I've written, to have it as a course, as a standalone course in the university, it was adopted. Whenever I suggest an entrepreneurship competition, a social entrepreneurship competition, an entrepreneurship competition which deals with the selling cause, they directly have it because they give a younger blood. We need to inject this momentum into our curricula. So definitely you have a point. But when we get older, we have to remain lifelong learners, as the time suggests actually, so that we'll keep on being a model or to have students identify with us.
Yes, there's a question in the front, a question in the back, and a question in the middle. So let's go in that order. I think we have a student in front as well. So let's go 1, 2, 3. Please.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I was Dr. Zahra's student, and now I'm working with her as a teaching assistant. I'm 21 years old. Regarding your point for teaching for students in a very young age. So, for example, I'm a part of health as well. So when there is a competition or any on-campus event, students, because they post on social media, again on Instagram or Facebook, so students come to me and they ask me, what is SDG? What is social responsibility? What is social entrepreneurship? Okay? So I try to tackle it from a youthful perspective. I try to shed the light on it, and they want to make me proud of them. Like they come to me and they tell me, now I'm working on my business. Now I want to do this. Now I want to add to the community. Okay? academia has some youth, okay, they encourage students and they push them to be something better. Thank you.
Actually, from a marketing perspective, we have to speak the language of our target audience. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's not our debate. If we are not in the pockets of our target audience, we are not there. If with time, if we do not have virtual existence, we do not physically exist. Fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. But we have to have strong virtual existence. We do have across different digital media platforms, And our presence on these digital media platforms doesn't have to be childish it can be robust actually to appeal to the younger and to the older generation.
So, and just to pair off of that, I think part of the challenge is bridging the divides to make sure that we have real experiences. So the digital experiences are great. I think the problem a lot of times with the youth, and I experienced this as a kid growing up, if you don't get your hands dirty, very often you don't know what it means to actually do something. And so a lot of the challenge, I think, in the Business for Peace space is even people who are from places that we might categorize as conflict zones don't actually know what that experience looks like. And sometimes that means just having them engage with people from those zones who are the same age as them. Sometimes in places like Lebanon, places like Egypt, it may just mean having them interact with someone who lives down the street who they otherwise never would have had an interaction with. And academic communities are great places, I think, to have that sort of engagement and to magnify it with this digital presence. There was a question in the back, I think I said number 2.
Right. So I've heard about the prospective collaboration.
Could you just introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
Sorry. Periana Malala, Head of External Relations Department in the Mr. Khair Foundation, coming from civil society. I would expect to hear more about collaboration or CSR between even the university itself and the civil society. And this is not just through initiatives or voluntary things, campaigns, or the models of which the students do themselves, but more of clear programs from the universities towards the vulnerable communities, the little children, the underprivileged ones, which you can, and not even through just scholarships for outstanding students, but for communities, we have a great percentage of illiterate children or dropouts. So I believe that there should be more commitment from universities, like for example the one you're presenting today, towards those communities. Thank you.
Please start.
Well, maybe I can share our experience at the university. We have a community service within our faculty. Each faculty at the university has a community service. It's part of our role as academics. The one who's heading the community service initiative, she's the vice dean. She's one of the academics of the department. And we're having lots of activities where we try to outreach the community. We are maybe hosting some events at the university. Let's keep it here that the students, the university is about students. And if we want to support the community, it's about that where we can get our students exposed to what's happening in the community. This is the point that Terry just mentioned and you just had on. It's about that having a hands-on experience, knowing what's happening around them. Coming from a private university, and we know that here in Egypt that there is like litigation. This is public university and this is private university, and you are coming from one of those top private universities. Even your students become part of the elite. This is the case. This is the reality. So when we are having such kind of initiatives and activities within the university, we get our students to be more exposed to the community, to go there. What's happening is that, again, there is kind of shyness, let's say here, from both sides, from the civil society and from the university as well. So let's not take the blame out, let's not put the blame on one side of the equation. The civil society rarely approaches universities. I've seen it. I've been working in the university at the PRME for the past 11 years. I've participated in so many activities happening at the university. And in very, very few cases, we were approached by any of the civil society organizations. And then it goes the other way around. When we try to approach organizations, maybe very lately, we started to incorporate in our activities some of the civil society organizations, maybe like another foundation for car accidents, where we try to promote this idea among the students, etc. So there is a missing link.
Fix this year.
Sorry?
You can fix this year.
I hope we can. And this is what we want to do. This is why, for example, I'm advisor for action where we try to support the community, the marginalized people in different parts of Egypt, and where students come up with projects to help them to be self-sufficient. Not we don't do work for them, we don't do charity, we help them to be self-sufficient. Because I am a believer in this value, and I support other initiatives within the university. So I personally, I am a believer in it. However, as I said, it needs mutual. We move towards you as if we're taking one step towards you and you take one step towards us. We need to be more transparent towards each other. And I think this is where, again, not the problem, it's the problem we're having with the civil society and the private sector as well. I don't want to say that lack of transparency, that we're doing it intentionally. But there is this lack of maybe trust and transparency, maybe there's something hidden here that stops us from collaborating together. No, I personally, as I said, I do advocate this kind of collaboration, yet it needs to be mutual from both sides, and the cause needs to be clear. And again, maybe this is one of the reasons why we shy from participating in activities related to the civil society, that the cause is not clear. Although all the causes are valid, although all the causes we need to help and support, but since we are an academic institution, we are having some kind of mandates. We follow the Supreme Council of Universities, so we are restricted in a way or another. So within our capacity to move, we need the cause, we clarify the cause, and we move on. As you said, maybe this is the year where, especially now with the different forums happening around the country, the calls for youth participation, university students, maybe we can start from now on. It could be experimental, and maybe we revisit the situation for the next year. And I'd love to talk to you after this session. Thank you.
Actually, I pursue your question from a strategic perspective. If a certain activity isn't across our supply chain, we have to outsource it. And many of the activities and the causes which universities advocate for and want to have initiatives or projects on aren't within their supply chain. So they can't but resort to major civil society players or to NGOs and create a partnership so that this initiative would be actualized. It has to be done this way. It can start with a focusing group. So whenever we have an initiative, we collect the major stakeholders from the private sector, from the government, from the NGOs, and this idea grows further and it can be actualized via a partnership or through outsourcing to the NGO. It has to be done this way.
Actually, what I have in mind, despite the idea of CSR, is also like win-win of having benefit of different activities, including the research and the focus groups, which you just mentioned. So I guess having access to very vulnerable communities, this is of multiple benefits, whether to the university or to the civil society itself.
Yeah, that's why I've said that I perceive it from a strategic perspective. So it is a win-win situation. It creates value for both, and it requires the resources of both.
We have one last question, please.
Well, it's more of a contribution than it is a question.
So could you give us your name and your...
Yeah, sorry. My name is Islam Higazi. I'm actually a Dr. Hasan student. I'm
a good audience.
I'm an entrepreneurship and sustainability graduate, and right now I work as a development executive in the health department. Now, I just wanted to touch on a few points of what we talked on. We were talking about values, and Dr. Cairo is an advisor for Enactus and also a judge in health rights. And I think through the young academics, for example, she's my sister, by the way, she's actually my twin.
It's a family affair.
Yeah, sort of. So people, for example, what I'm saying is we can use the academics like Professor Hasan, a TA who's already a young person that I guess will be able to reach people in her age much easier because she understands the generation much better. And delivering through communities and clubs and universities, using that as a platform to teach them the values and the, for example, the gentleman was talking about here, we those can be used to get these values and ethics and teachings through to the students. By, for example, let's say in HUD price, for example, Bill Clinton always every year sets the agenda for whatever the competition is going to be based on, and that can be, for example, one of the requirements that, for example, I think must be ethical, must follow one of the SDGs or 2 or 3 or whatever. So these principles can be reached to the youth, which is going to be the next generation, through these already existing platforms. So, for example, HUD prices is already existed in over 90% of the 42 universities in Egypt. So Now, second thing, which is what I'm coming here as officially, I'm coming here as an MBC ambassador. MBC ambassador, which is the CSR section of the embassy group. Now, what we're doing is that we're all over the MENA region. So we're not just here in Egypt. We're in most of the Arab countries, and there are ambassadors in each and every country. What we do is that we work we choose an SDG, one of the SDGs, and then we develop a project, and then we work on it, and we get MBC support and mentorship. This is actually a great way of how the media, as we were talking about, can be used to sort of teach a lot of people about the SDGs, and especially people in our generation, about the SDGs, and through the use of media. So, for example, MBC always tries to incorporate the SDGs in its shows and in its competitions, and that's for example a real life example of how the media is already being used to try to raise awareness and teach people about the SDGs. So it was more of a contribution, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And I just wanted to thank this wonderful panel for all the experience that is brought together in just one place. This is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a great place to drop off. What I would ask each and every one of you is make sure you continue the engagement with Prime. We would absolutely love to have you on our mailing list for the Prime Business for Peace Working Group. So if you want to be on the mailing list, just see me afterwards and drop me a card, even if you don't have time to stay for longer. It was such a pleasure to have all of you here. Thank you so much for sticking around for the 2 hours for it. I hope you got something out of it. I know we certainly got something out of it, hearing from you, but also hearing from each other. And enjoy the conference.